Hey, how's it going? Well, I was of two minds how I was going to do or cover my readings for Horror Mayhem. That's the reading event that I'm participating in this month. Horror Mayhem was created by the Bookish Bryants, Scott and Becky Bryant. Many other cool channels are participating in it. And I don't know how the other channels are going to handle their postings or their video making. I was going to try to go a different route that I did last year, but those ideas didn't really strike me as effective. So I thought I would just simply do what I did last year. If it, it kind of worked last year just by doing a weekly update of my reading. Horror Mayhem is dedicated to reading short fiction during the month of May. Short horror fiction, which could be short novels under 200 or 250 pages, or short stories, novelettes, novellas, etc. And I enjoyed doing this event last year. I did an earlier video about my possible TBR, possible choices for what I could read. And I read a couple of those this past week. Now, I know it's not quite a full week yet when this video will post. I had a 5-day weekend off for the Golden Week holiday here in Japan, so I got some reading done. Not as much as I would have liked, but I did get some done. It was a pretty active holiday. Technically, the first week would be finishing on the Thursday, the 7th, but actually, I'm going to be working on the 7th, so I'm going to just call it right now where it is and get into what I read so far. And it was a few cool things. The first thing I read was Hellboy, Seed of Destruction. That's the very first volume of the Hellboy comic with art by Mignola and story by John Byrne. Now, John Byrne is a well-known comics writer. He wrote a really highly regarded run on the X-Men and on the Fantastic Four and several others. After this point, I think Mike Mignola, the artist and original conceiver of the Hellboy character and the mythos surrounding it, went on to write them himself. And according to a lot of fans, this one, because it's written by another person, it's written by John Byrne, doesn't quite capture the snarky, sarcastic, kind of deadpan kind of personality of Hellboy, but it's still a very good story. It's 4 issues, 128 pages about for this book, and it's talking about a little bit about the origin of Hellboy, but just a bit, and mostly about his first chronicled adventure, not his first ever adventure. And this particular issue, or set of issues, this particular volume was the main inspiration for Guillermo del Toro's original Hellboy movie that came out. Guillermo del Toro did 2 Hellboy movies, the first Hellboy and then Hellboy the Golden Army. I think the first one is a little better, although I like them both. And his conception of Hellboy is a little different. He conceives of Hellboy as kind of a teenager in this adult body, whereas he's more like a hard-boiled detective gumshoe kind of character in the comics. And anyway, some elements of the plot of that first Hellboy movie are in this Seed of Destruction. So again, some fantastic art, very, very distinctive and unique. Mike Mignola's style. We have an introduction by Robert Bloch here, which is interesting, talking about how he used to kind of think comics back in his day were kind of the right people who wrote for comics looked down on it. Weren't it wasn't something that something that they made money on, but they didn't want to let it be known in their writerly circles or anything. But of course, in later years, the comics became quite much more respectable and established, and even some literary works being done in them, of course. So this is the 4 issues are broken into 4 chapters, and the first one starts with the flashback to 1944, towards the end of the war, and then the mad monk Rasputin is working with the Nazis to supposedly summon these elder gods, these 7 kind of squamous, tentacled monstrosities similar to the kind of Lovecraftian other ones, or elder gods, or kind of coming from alternate dimensions or from deep in space. And instead, what he does is he summons in a different location where the British and American forces are. He summons Hellboy, baby Hellboy. And then we flash forward to, contemporary time, which this was written published in 1994, where Hellboy's been summoned to his mentor and kind of father figure, Professor Brutenholm, called Broom for short, Professor Broom, to his place to get a warning. Professor Broom had went on this expedition with the family of Cavendish, 3 Cavendish heirs, to this remote temple in the shades of at the Mountains of Madness, more of which anon. But we had strange tentacled god figurines or statuary in this temple, and then all of a sudden a bunch of frogs come in as Brudenholm's telling Hellboy this tale, and the one turns into a frog monster and kills Professor Broom, and Hellboy's out fighting with it and beating the shit out of it, and kills it basically. And then that leads to some dossier on some of the Nazis that were working with Rasputin. Of course, they don't know it's Rasputin at that time. And then what happens next is, of course, this remote mansion built on this lake, and it's kind of a sinister place, and the foundations are sinking slowly into the sediment, and the bottom, the kind of basement floors are flooded by the waters of this lake, and there's something really evil in the lake. And Hellboy and his fellow BPRD members, BPRD stands for the Bureau of Paranormal Research and Development, and he comes with Liz Sherman, who in Del Toro's vision has a romantic relationship with Hellboy, which doesn't exist in the comics as far as I'm aware. Liz Sherman has pyrotechnic abilities. She's able to summon and control fire. And they also are accompanied by Hellboy's close friend, Abe Sapien, this several hundred-year-old intelligent fish man. And he comes in a disguise and, wearing a fake beard, etc., to talk to this Mrs. Cavendish, the kind of matriarch of this family that for years has been trying to reach this temple. And she's actually kind of being controlled by this sinister Rasputin figure, who basically summoned Hellboy as kind of a link in the chain to summon these elder gods into the world, to destroy the world, etc. And then Hellboy and Abe and Liz have to work together to stop this from happening. Plenty of exciting battles with Hellboy and Abe skulking around undersea in these kind of submerged crypts under the house, and Rasputin giving his backstory about how he, again, he's doing his monologuing, his villain monologuing, and then summoning these kind of hideous giant outer space monstrosities. Anyway, very, very cool story, and really enjoyable. So while it might not be 100% there yet as far as the realization of Hellboy's snarky, combative character, it's kind of a gumshoe, tough guy, sarcastic fighter. So he has a normal left hand and he has a big rock right hand. And he's stronger than a normal human. He's not superhuman. He gets beat up, etc. But that big rock sort of hand, which you might remember from the movie if you saw it. It was pretty well realized in the makeup there. Can clobber most creatures. Then the book, it talks a little bit about some of the very first conceptual art that Mignola came up with when he was kind of toying around with the idea of Hellboy. And then there's a couple of cool short stories where, just kind of, you did these, I think, for some kind of Comic-Con or some sort of comic convention where maybe they were published for attendees here, where he fights a kind of giant Anubis dog creature thing, and just real short. And then this would have been good for Levi's April. He fights head in a jar controlling a giant intelligent gorilla who's about to do some terrible things to this poor lady strapped down on the table, and Hellboy comes to the rescue at the last minute. And then we have this cool Hellboy gallery. Basically, other artists. We have art from Simon Bisley, Mike Allred, Art Adams, Frank Miller, Fred Blanchard, and Gary Gianni. And maybe that's in order. So again, very different style than the usual Mignola style, but it's still cool to see how other people conceive of Hellboy. A nice Gustav Klimt kind of homage there, and a black and white, pretty cool illustration. Anyway, this was a lot of fun. It was a brief read. I read it in one, sitting basically, and really enjoyed it. And the only bad side was I didn't have any more that I could read, so I need to get my hands on some more issues. I'm going to look at the kind of trade paper volumes of that have like 4 sets of stories. This one is 4 issues, so I'm assuming the others are anywhere from 4 to 6 issues. And there's 4 of those, I believe, that have different stories in chronological order, and then there's some others that have some short stories featuring Hellboy. So we'll get my hands on those at some stage for sure. Okay, well, speaking of evil eldritch entities from beyond, we have the next thing I read, and it took me a little while because I kept nodding off in some slower parts of it, but I've been meaning to read this for a long, long time, and that's At the Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft. Now, I have it in this Grafton Books edition. I probably have another edition somewhere back in storage in the States, but this one contains a lot of other of his novels and novelettes. He doesn't have many novels, and this wouldn't even be classed as a novel these days. It's about 134, 35 pages in this book's edition. So probably, 40,000 plus words or so. But it was definitely a novel at the time, and that was one of the problems for Lovecraft, is he was not able to get it published in his usual location, Weird Tales, because he wrote this over 2 months, February and March in 1931. He submitted it to Farnsworth Wright, the famed editor of Weird Tales magazine, but Wright determined it was too long and to publish in his magazine and rejected it. And so 5 years later, it appeared in Astounding magazine, probably to a much greater readership, I would guess, over 3 months in 3 different installments, February, March, and April of 1936. So I'll try to put up some of the covers from those pulp issues here. And of course, afterwards, it saw publication in book form in many different editions. So this is really an interesting and eerie and impressive piece of work in a lot of ways. However, I do feel it's too long and rather verbose in the Lovecraft style. Like I said, I nodded off a few times in the middle. I think it's more from Lovecraft kind of repeating himself a little bit here and there, but it is really an incredible piece of work in a lot of ways. So this book centers around an ill-fated expedition from Miskatonic University, headed by a man named Dyer, Professor Dyer. He's, I believe, an engineer or a geologist. I think he may be a geologist, not an engineer. And he and several other faculty and scientists, researchers, and some graduate students undertake a expedition to the South Pole, to Antarctica, where one of their number, a man named Pabodi, has come up with a really kind of high-tech drill, a new drilling apparatus that can drill much better than previous attempts. So they want to really get down deep into the core and get some new rock and geological samples, which they think will, really edify the scientific community. And what they find along the way is something much more than that, and more than humanity bargained for in typical Lovecraft style. So basically, the book starts off quite interestingly. It's kind of very realistic, nuts and bolts sort of detailing the beginning of the expedition, how they have these, 5 planes. Of course, this would be 1930, so 31. So the planes would be, I guess, biplanes maybe, or monoplanes, but not, the typical planes we think of now. They would have been uncovered, kind of cockpits, etc. So it really details the coldness and how they have all these, they're setting up these different base camps. They have 2 ships that they use as kind of, to transport them down to Antarctica. And then they set up different base camps. And one, Professor Lake goes off and starts his own expedition, his own kind of drilling expedition, because they had found some strange footprints, kind of star-shaped prints that this Lake guy figures are not normal earthly sort of footprints, but he kind of keeps that to himself. But he's bound and determined to go off to this, to the west, I believe. And, at this time, this is after the Shackleton and the Byrne expeditions, a lot of famous expeditions, which Lovecraft references in this story. And he was apparently really fascinated, obsessed almost with these various Antarctic exploration expeditions and missions, and really interested in what was going on down there. And it was at the early enough time where he could use his imagination to fill in some of the gaps on the map. And so he comes up with this huge mountain range, this high mountain range that's taller than Mount Everest when they eventually get there. And there's even a greater one beyond, where even greater perils might lurk. Anyway, Lake goes over here to these mountains, and they set up on kind of the foothills or some plateau near the mountains. They set up a camp. Basically, they're drilling, and they unearth a hole. They're kind of into this cave, and they go down and they find some strange kind of star-patterned limestone sort of carvings, and then eventually they find some bodies. They find these weird kind of tubular creatures that are a couple of meters tall, over 6 feet tall if you stand them on end, and they have these weird little pseudopods to move around, and little stalks with eyes on, very strange alien things. And some are in partial decomposition states, and others are basically pristine, and they have this really tough leathery hide that resists, dissection from Lake. And anyway, the dogs just start going, the sled dog team start going nuts, so cuckoo with the stench of these creatures, and Lake's cutting on them and sending back reports to the base camp where the narrator, Dyer, is. And then everyone's all excited. We're going to come see you right away, and we'll fly over there. And then the next day, nothing. There's nothing. And so Dyer and his team call back some other planes that they have, or one plane, I guess, that they had still at their disposal, and fly the 700 miles or whatever over to Lake's camp. And what they find there is a bunch of dismembered, hacked up remains of dogs and humans. And none of these supposed tubular creatures are left except for these 6 that were already pretty deteriorated. And they have been buried under the ice in this 5-star kind of pattern with one in the center. And, they're all freaking out, of course, but they're trying to think of some rational explanation for what happened. So this missing expedition member, Gedney, and one dog are missing. And so they're wondering, did Gedney go crazy and cut up these people? But then what happened to the other body? The other bodies of these 8 supposedly pristine specimens of these weird tubular creatures that, there's mentions all the way through of the Necronomicon being talked about, and in the library at the Miskatonic University there. And, before he stopped communication, Lake was calling these creatures, kind of half jokingly, the old ones, etc. Anyway, various things have been taken, 3 sledges and a bunch of equipment and some books and research papers have been taken away, and there's weird smudge marks and these kind of 5-pointed star type pseudopod tracks all over the place. It's pretty clear to the reader that these creatures came back alive and basically decided to, they found what I'm assuming the narrator doesn't name that it's Lake, but we're assuming that Lake himself was then in turn dissected by these creatures who are also trying to figure out who are these ape-like humans that have come across them, and maybe they were just in some kind of hibernated state. where they were found in this cavern. And anyway, eventually the team leader, the narrator, Dyer, and another graduate student named Danforth fly up to the ridge, because up on the mountains there's all these kind of looks like very not made by intelligence sort of structures up on the mountains, and basically they fly over this ridge at this really, really high, the lowest point of this higher than Everest kind of elevation mountains, and they go across the other side and they see this vast city carved out of stone, and they explore that for the rest of the book. The whole narrative is set up, it kind of says at the start that we know that this Dyer guy has survived this, so some of the tension might go out that way, but what he finds there and what he and his compadre find there is what's kind of the teasing suspense of the rest of the book, the rest of the story. Dyer is only kind of saying the real, they kind of covered up or didn't report all that they found to the world for fear of being a laughing stock, and also that no one would believe them, etc. But there's another expedition that's getting ready to be mounted to this same location because of what that was supposedly discovered here by this Dyer expedition. And so the narrator, Dyer, is trying his best to warn them off. Okay, I'm going to tell you the whole story, and you better stay away, because it not only would be the end of you possibly, but perhaps the end of life on Earth as we know it. Anyhow, he and Danforth, he then relates how slowly that they go into this, they explore, they land their plane on a little kind of shelf, and they go down into these various rooms with runes of, ancient millennia. They figure that these creatures were here for, millions and millions of years ago, and the city dates from that time, and something caused these creatures to abandon the city, and there's all these kind of bas reliefs and kind of murals carved onto the stone of the walls, depicting the history of their race and how they first came to the earth, and how they developed some interstellar enemies, and there was kind of a war, maybe with kind of Cthulhu type creatures. And anyway, there's a middle section where this history is kind of dropped in a big chunk of exposition, which is interesting, but it really slows things down. But then we pick back up at the end as Dyer and Danforth continue into this kind of they want to go down into this pit which leads to this underground sea, where maybe the creatures went back to their subterranean kingdoms, I guess, and they come across some creepy stuff. So I guess I would say a couple things. This is obviously a very influential piece of work. It kind of was published late in Lovecraft's life and kind of tied together a fair amount of his other mythos that he built up over his various stories and novellas. And it's quite effective. It sets an eerie tone, kind of eldritch, otherworldly horror that Lovecraft is particularly was particularly good at doing in his other stories. It is too long, I think. I think that it would highly benefit from being pruned down to at least half its length, if not shorter. I've read some of Lovecraft's other novelettes. They're kind of in the 60 to 80 page range, and those are all much more focused and effective because of that. So I think this one would be hard work for some people. He does have what some call purple prose. He doesn't get overly, lurid and crazy until towards the end, I suppose. And but there's some repetition here. He takes his time to lead up to the story, and perhaps more time than he needed to. But it's still a very interesting read, very fascinating, very creative and imaginative. And, writing this at the time he was, he was doing his own thing, and he was way ahead of his time in a lot of ways, coming up with this kind of alternate dimensions or alternate far outer space kind of races of creatures the whole idea must have been conceptually fresh for that time. As he says, the old ones here were the progenitors of the human race. In fact, all life on Earth, they kind of formed with their skill of manipulating various basic organic compounds, etc. I'm sure that rubbed a lot of the religious groups at the time the wrong way, for sure. Anyway, it's a work of pure science fiction and full-on horror in parts. It's not his scariest story, I don't think, but it is very interesting in its implications. So I enjoyed that a lot. I did struggle with part of it as far as getting through some of the, because there's like no dialogue, or almost no dialogue. It's just all exposition and description. And a lot of it's interesting, a lot of it's very effective. Some of it is just plain long-winded. But anyway, I would recommend it for fans of that kind of weird horror fiction, science fiction horror stuff. So that was very cool. I'm glad I finally read that very influential story. And then I finished up the week so far anyway. I read 3 stories out of this beauty. This is the Atomic Werewolves and Man-Eating Plants, one of the Men's Adventure library editions from Bob Dice and Wyatt Doyle. So kind of more horror tales and weird science fiction, horror, lurid kind of stories from the men's adventure magazines from the 50s through the 70s. And most of these stories, I think, are from the 50s and 60s. Looks like they're all from 53 up to 66. And I read 3 stories out of this, and they were pretty interesting. It's got the book has the usual cool introduction about, the pulps and weird tales and how the men's adventure magazines grew out of that tradition, the pulp tradition. And so what I read here, I read 3 stories. The first I read was Trapped by a Man-Eating Tree by Robert Moore. And that was a really short and pretty horrific tale about these 3 Dutch naval officers who escaped from a Japanese prison camp on some island in the South Pacific, and then their boat capsizes and they wash up on the shore of this tropical island. They're all starved and weak, but they spend a few days on the beach trying to get their strength back, roasting fish that they catch and resting up. And then they go to explore. They want to get to a higher point of the island so they can try to carefully flag down a friendly vessel to be rescued. But what they find there are these kinds of man-eating trees, which are pretty horrific. And it's just like a 5-page story, but narrated by one of these men, and he's the only one that survives, basically. So let's just say that these trees are pretty deadly, and he doesn't quite escape unscathed. As often happens in these men's adventure stories where there's attacking plants or animals or whatever, the narrator doesn't often make it out without some serious wounds or loss of limbs, etc. That was fun. The other 2 were a little longer and a little more effective. So the Trapped in the Man-Eating Tree was published in Man's Life in March 1958. That was by Robert Moore. This is the cover of the Man's Life magazine that appeared in originally. There's not a giant gorilla in this particular story, but that one must be pretty cool. Then I read something called The Werewolf and the Cowboy, which was really cool. Just love the way these books are formatted. So that's the cover of the original issue that The Werewolf and the Cowboy appeared in. Of course, the cover has nothing to do with the story itself. It's by Stuart Evans in C for Men, November 1961. Here's a pretty terrible illustration for the story, but this one's really cool. This one's about a rancher, a cowhand, I guess. This kind of town on the Idaho-Montana border. I guess it's set at the present time, or at least contemporary time as when this was written in 1961. Anyway, detailing his fighting with battles, a couple of battles he has with this werewolf that's preying on stock as well as any humans that get in its way. And there happens to be a stranger in the town who looks a little bestial and says, "You might be dealing with the werewolf." And he has big yellow teeth and he kind of smirks when he talks to this hunter about what they might be fighting a werewolf. This cowboy's like, I don't know about this guy. And of course, when he ends up fighting this werewolf, it's in a wolf form, but it doesn't look quite like a wolf, and it's like double the size of a normal wolf. It's like a 400-pound, 6-foot long creature, and a pretty cool story. I like this one a lot. And it has a nice little ending there. And then the last one I read was really a wild story, especially when it's revealed what happened, what caused these giant tarantulas to exist. And this is Strange Cult of the Vampire Tarantulas. And this is this is a men's adventure story to the T. It's got this doctor and his sexy lab assistant that he's falling for, and described in quite sensual terms. And basically 2 parties of scientists that went to this remote island, I believe somewhere in the Indonesian peninsula or something, they've gone missing. And so the main character is dispatched to, they have some interesting photo elements to this, where they do kind of reenact some parts of it, not 100% accurately. But this man and this attractive lady, they're sent out on a rescue mission. Their boat capsizes. They wash up on the shore of this island. The woman is promptly attacked by this giant evil-eyed tarantula with a body. The hairy body is about 2 feet, and the legs go out 6 feet or so. And apparently they find this castle, but it's surrounded by on the island. It's surrounded by all these tarantulas, and this is the wacky part of it. The tarantulas are actually not real spiders that have been increased in size by scientific means, but this crazy doctor named Dr. Unicorn for some stupid reason. But anyway, he and his hunchbacked dwarf assistant, he has done these, he was jilted by women in the past apparently, and he's done these experiments on various local women or women from this research group. Apparently the first research group has been decimated, but the survivors of the second group are in this dungeon where our hero is eventually knocked unconscious and put there. And the Dr. Unicorn apparently does some kind of weird experiment to change women into these hairy giant tarantula creatures, and they have to survive by sucking on male blood. So he keeps the male prisoners alive until they can be fed to these creatures, and he's about to do the same to the beautiful buxom blonde lady friend of our narrator here. Anyway, just a wild, goofy, fun, but pretty effectively violent and exciting story. It has a lot of scope for a pretty short tale. Again, very silly, but very fun. I enjoyed that one a lot. That concludes my reading for Horror Mayhem for this first week of May. Hope you found something interesting in there, and I recommend all of these to varying degrees. So that's it for now. I'll look forward to seeing you in my next video. Take care and enjoy whatever you are reading. See you later.